Today's episode, we are going to the worst outdoor deaths ever recorded. From a couple turning a simple skydive into a risky mid-air stunt, to a woman walking less than a quarter mile to safety, unaware the fire had already moved ahead of her, faster than she expected. It was October 13th, 2014. At a coastal dive site in South Sinai, Egypt. The water was flat and clear. A few divers floated nearby. From the surface, everything looked calm and open. There was no sign of how deep it dropped or how quickly conditions changed below. Priya Anand was 28 years old and worked as a graphic designer in Bangalore. Outside of work, she enjoyed pushing herself physically and often learned new skills on her own without formal training. She relied on repetition and confidence rather than structured instruction, and over time, that approach shaped how she handled risk. A few months before the incident, she and her boyfriend booked a skydiving experience for their 3rd anniversary. It was meant to be a simple tandem jump, something memorable they could share. But as the date approached, they started talking about doing more than just the standard fall. They had both seen videos online of skydivers performing mid-air poses, controlled movements that looked balanced and almost effortless. One idea stood out to them: Priya standing on her boyfriend's shoulders during freefall. Neither of them had any formal skydiving training beyond the required safety briefing. At the drop zone, instructors explained the basics: how to position the body, how to stay stable in the air, and what to expect during deployment and landing. When the idea of attempting a mid-air pose came up, it was discouraged. The instructors emphasized keeping movements minimal and maintaining stability at all times. Priya and her boyfriend agreed to follow the instructions. However, once they were in the plane and climbing to altitude, the idea remained. The aircraft ascended steadily, and the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted as jumpers prepared. When it was their turn, Priya and her boyfriend moved toward the open door, each secured to an instructor. The wind rushed in as the door opened, and after a brief moment at the edge, they exited together. The initial phase of the jump was stable, the airflow supported their bodies, and both instructors maintained control, keeping them aligned during the descent. For several seconds, everything followed the expected pattern. Then Priya initiated movement toward her boyfriend. It was not part of the plan discussed with the instructors, but both she and her boyfriend recognized the signal. He adjusted his body position slightly, extending his arms to increase surface area and stability. Priya shifted closer and began to raise herself upward, placing her foot against his leg and pushing higher toward his shoulders. For a brief moment, the position was almost held, but the added weight disrupted the balance between them. His body dipped unevenly, and the airflow around them changed immediately. The stability they had at the start of the fall broke apart. Priya's footing slipped and the point of contact between them failed. She separated from him and began to rotate. The rotation was uncontrolled. Her body turned sideways, then into a spin. She attempted to correct it, but each movement increased the instability. The instructor behind her reached forward to regain control, but the combination of speed, position, and rotation made it difficult to secure her quickly. As they continued to fall, her body shifted into a head-down angle, increasing the speed and force of the airflow. With the altitude dropping, the instructor deployed the parachute earlier than planned. The canopy opened, but her body was not properly aligned. The force of the parachute deployment traveled unevenly through her body. Her lower half snapped into position first, while her upper body lagged due to the rotation. This created a concentrated strain through her neck at the moment of full deployment. From the ground, the parachute appeared to open normally, but the descent that followed lacked the controlled movement expected in a stable landing. Emergency responders were already on standby and reached her immediately after landing. She was unresponsive, and resuscitation efforts were started without delay, but there was no recovery. The medical report concluded that the cause of death was a fatal cervical spine injury caused during parachute deployment while her body was misaligned. The instability created during the attempted mid-air maneuver led directly to the conditions that made the deployment force uneven and concentrated. Her boyfriend landed separately with minor injuries. Instructors later confirmed that the maneuver they attempted required advanced training and precise coordination under controlled conditions. Without that training, even a brief loss of stability during freefall could escalate rapidly. It was January 18, 2015, in Oymyakon. The cold had settled in days earlier and never lifted. Air temperatures stayed below -45 degrees Celsius, turning every exposed surface brittle. Breath froze mid-air. Sound carried strangely in the stillness. There were no storms that morning, no wind strong enough to warn of danger, just a steady, crushing cold that erased mistakes slowly and without noise. Nora Vasquez, 38, arrived in Oymyakon as part of a seasonal rotation supporting remote infrastructure. The work required constant movement between regions, often in harsh conditions, something she had grown used to over the years. 3 months earlier, her husband had died, but before that, they had planned to visit extreme places together. Oymyakon had been one of them, and she chose to continue the trip alone. She carried only essential gear, insulated clothing, a sub-zero rated sleeping bag, food supplies, a tarp, and a compact shovel. During her first days there, locals showed her how to build a temporary snow shelter using compacted blocks cut from packed ground. The structure, similar to an igloo, was meant to block wind, not hold heat for long periods. Later, she chose a flat area beyond the main cluster of buildings and began setting it up. By late afternoon, she built the dome, stacking cut blocks into a tight shape. From the outside, it looked solid. Inside, it held a small pocket of warmer air at first. She sealed gaps with loose snow and placed her pack near the entrance. There was no stove, no external heat, only her body and the insulation she carried. She lay her sleeping bag directly on the snow. At first, it seemed stable, but the ground beneath her pulled heat away continuously. Without any insulating layer under the bag, the cold transferred straight through. The packed snow acted as a steady heat sink, drawing warmth from her body even while she remained still. An earlier effort from building had also left a light layer of sweat under her clothing. As she settled, that moisture began to cool, accelerating heat loss. Inside the shelter, moisture from her breath froze along the inner walls, forming a thin layer of ice. As night set in, the temperature dropped further. The small amount of warmth inside faded. The air cooled until it matched the conditions outside. The base of the structure began to shift slightly as it settled. Small gaps opened near the lower blocks, allowing narrow drafts of cold air to move through. Each one reduced what little heat remained inside. At some point during the night, she adjusted her position, likely trying to reduce exposure to the cold surface beneath her. Compression marks showed she pressed closer to the wall, but the change did not help. The cold was no longer just around her, it was under her, above her, and moving through the space. As her core temperature dropped, her movement slowed. Fine motor control became harder. Adjustments to clothing or position became less effective. The cold reduced her ability to respond before she could correct the conditions. The structure itself remained intact. It continued to block the wind, but it no longer held any usable warmth. Inside, the temperature settled into the same range as the surrounding environment, and the space functioned no differently than being outside. By early morning, the interior surface had fully iced over. Her breath no longer left visible condensation. The space had become still. There were no signs of exit attempts, no displaced blocks, no widened opening. The position of her body indicated she had remained inside, unable to respond as conditions worsened. The medical report later confirmed hypothermia as the cause of death. Core temperature had dropped to a level where cardiac function slowed, then stopped. There were no external injuries, no signs of struggle. The environment alone had been sufficient. Her pack was found near the entrance, undisturbed. Inside were her journal and personal items. Earlier entries described the trip she and her husband had planned, places they had wanted to see together. The final entry ended mid-sentence. It was September 12, 2017, on a mountain trail in Colorado. The morning was clear, with cool air at higher elevation and steady visibility across the ridge. The path ran narrow in sections, cut along exposed terrain with steep drop-offs on one side. For days, conditions had been stable. That afternoon, the only change was the wind and the storm building beyond the peaks. That morning, Dio Mensa, 50, set out for a solo ride along a ridgeline trail. He had spent years working as a mail carrier, walking the same routes every day. When knee problems forced him to stop, the sudden loss of routine stayed with him. Cycling became his replacement, something structured, physical, and measurable. He rode alone, gradually increasing distance, using each ride to rebuild what he felt he had lost. The trail followed a narrow ridge, with loose gravel layered over hard-packed dirt. Early in the day, conditions were stable. The sky was clear, the ground firm, and the wind light. He moved steadily, staying controlled through the exposed sections. By midday, the environment began to shift. Wind pushed across the ridge in stronger bursts, cutting sideways through open areas. He paused and stepped off the trail, watching the movement below as trees bent and dust lifted in short waves. The gusts came and went, then eased enough to continue. Around 1:30 p.m. he resumed riding. The first stretch held steady. He stayed seated, managing speed and balance as the trail curved along the edge, with a steep drop to one side. It required focus, but it was within his ability. Farther along, the sky began to close. Clouds moved in from higher ground, dimming the light. The temperature dropped slightly. A low rumble of thunder followed, distant but distinct. There was no nearby shelter and no quick exit from the ridge. He continued forward. Partway through an exposed section, the air shifted again. The wind dropped briefly, followed by a sudden flash. Lightning struck somewhere along the ridge, not directly on him but close enough to carry current through the ground beneath him. The effect was not immediate or clean. He flinched sharply, his posture tightening as a jolt ran through him. For a moment, his grip changed, uneven, not fully controlled. His vision blurred slightly, and his sense of balance shifted. The bike continued moving, but his response lagged. What should have been a small correction came late. The front wheel drifted off its line toward the outer edge, where loose gravel had collected. He adjusted, but the movement lacked precision. The tire rolled onto the unstable surface and slipped sideways. He tried to recover, shifting his weight, but the delay carried through. The correction didn't hold. The bike tipped and he went over the edge. The slope below was steep and uneven, breaking into dirt and exposed rock. He struck the incline first, then continued downward, tumoring across the terrain. The descent carried him through multiple impacts before he came to rest against a cluster of rocks below the trail. Above him, the bike remained near the edge, caught in low brush. The storm moved through shortly after, bringing wind and light rain. No other riders were in the area. His satellite device remained secured in his pack. When he failed to check in that evening, his daughter reported him missing. Search teams used his last known signal to narrow the area and reached the ridgeline the following day. He was found below the trail where the fall had ended. The medical report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma from the fall. Evidence of electrical exposure was also noted, consistent with a nearby lightning strike affecting the ground. Investigators determined that the brief disorientation and delayed motor response following the strike contributed to the loss of control that led to the fall. It was July 22, 2016 in Paris catacombs. The morning above ground was ordinary. Tourists moving through the city, traffic steady, nothing out of place. Below, the air remained the same as it always did, still, cool and dry, carrying the faint mineral scent of stone and dust. There were no signs of danger at the entrance, no indication that anything inside had changed. Tomas Ruiz, 61, had spent decades in construction. After being diagnosed with high blood pressure, he was advised to stay active. Over time, he developed an interest in confined exploration, spaces that required slow, controlled movement. He followed basic precautions, multiple lights, simple gear, and a written plan left behind. But the catacombs were not controlled environments. Large sections were unofficial, uneven, and changed over time. He had been there before with others. That morning, he entered alone. The early corridors were familiar, long, narrow tunnels, some reinforced, others worn and irregular. He moved through them steadily, following a route he recognized. Around 10 a.m., he turned into a side passage he had only attempted once. It was narrower and partially collapsed in places. The first time, someone had guided him through. This time, he approached it on his own. By 10:45 a.m., he reached a tight section where the ceiling dropped sharply. The passage angled downward, forcing his head lower than his feet. He removed his pack, pushed it ahead, and lowered himself flat against the stone. Using his arms, he pulled himself forward. At first, the movement was steady. The space was tight but manageable. The rock pressed against his chest and sides as he advanced, keeping his body aligned with the narrow channel. About halfway through, that alignment shifted. It was slight. His hips turned just enough to wedge unevenly between the walls. When he tried to move forward again, there was resistance. He stopped, adjusted, and tried again. The space did not give. He tried to move backward, but the slope worked against him. With his head lower than his feet, he couldn't generate enough force to push himself out. His legs slipped against the ground, unable to get traction. The position held him in place. At first, he stayed in control. He exhaled to reduce the space his chest occupied and made small adjustments, shifting his shoulders, angling his hips. Each movement was deliberate, but none created enough room to free him. As time passed, the pressure against his chest became constant. With the rock pressing into him, his lungs could not expand fully. Each breath was shorter than the last. To pull in more air, he had to work harder, but the space did not allow it. His breathing stayed shallow. His arms began to tire from holding his position. There was no way to rest fully, no space to shift weight or relieve pressure. The longer he stayed in place, the harder it became to move at all. He continued trying to adjust, but each attempt took more effort and gave fewer results. His breathing became uneven. The restricted position forced him to rely on smaller breaths, increasing the strain on his body over time. As the hours passed, fatigue set in. His movements slowed. His responses became less precise. The pressure on his chest remained unchanged, limiting each breath and preventing recovery. At some point in the afternoon, the effort to maintain even shallow breathing became too much. Still pinned in the same position, he lost consciousness inside the passage. When he did not return, search teams were sent in that night. They followed the route he was expected to take and located him in the narrow section. The opening was narrow and easy to miss without knowing where to look. Once found, they could not reach him directly. The surrounding stone had to be chipped away piece by piece to widen the space enough to access his position. The work continued into the next morning. By the time they reached him, the passage around that section had been altered, but only enough to remove him. The cause of death was later identified as positional asphyxia. His chest had been compressed for too long, preventing normal breathing and leading to respiratory failure. After the recovery, no further changes were made. The area remained part of the same network, with the same tight angle and limited clearance. Movement continued through nearby sections of the catacombs, while that narrow passage stayed as it was, unchanged in how it allowed entry, and unchanged in how little room it gave once movement stopped. It was August 14, 2018, in the countryside of California. The morning was already warm before 9, dry and still. The road felt familiar. The trees didn't move. From the trailhead, everything looked normal. No smoke, no warnings, nothing unusual. It felt like any other quiet summer morning in the foothills. Lena Schreiber was 52 and had spent most of her life teaching 4th grade in Fresno. After retiring, she focused on photography, spending weekends in the Sierra foothills documenting burn areas. She tracked how wildflowers, especially fire poppies, returned after fires, revisiting the same sites over time to build her own record. That morning, she returned to a burn scar from 2 years earlier to document it again. She arrived just before 9 a.m. The temperature was rising, with a forecast in the upper 90s. Fire danger was very great, but she did not check for active fire updates. The area was familiar to her. By 10:15 a.m., she was deep inside the burn scar. The ground was uneven, layered with ash and dry grass, broken by clusters of bright orange poppies. She moved slowly through the area, stopping often, crouching low to frame shots, adjusting her position by small amounts to capture the details she had come for. This was the part she cared about most. Close work, patient, controlled. Around 10:30, she noticed the smell of smoke. She stood and looked toward the ridge. A thin column was rising in the distance. It didn't appear aggressive. There were no visible flames, no sound beyond the usual quiet of the forest. She took a photo of it, then turned back toward the road. The distance was short, less than 1/3 of a mile. She began walking, retracing her way out. The burn scar around her was not open space. Dead trees stood dry and brittle, and fallen branches covered the ground. The same conditions that allowed the flowers to grow had also left the area filled with dry fuel, and months without rain had left everything ready to burn. At about 11 a.m., the wind shifted. She heard it before she saw anything change, a steady rush building through the trees, louder than before. The sound moved across the ridge like a wave. Then the fire reached the slope above her. It did not appear as a single advancing line. Instead, embers lifted high into the air and carried forward on the wind, dropping into the dry ground ahead. Small fires began to appear in separate patches, first one, then several more, igniting grass, fallen branches, and dead wood at different points around her. Within minutes, the pattern changed. She was no longer moving away from a distant fire. It was forming around her. The air heated quickly, smoke thickened and became harder to breathe. She took out her phone and called 911, saying she was in a burned area near a forest road and the fire was getting closer. The dispatcher asked for her location, but the signal kept cutting out. She tried to give details, but the call dropped before she could finish. She started moving toward the road. The ground slowed her down. Ash covered the surface and hid uneven areas. Rocks shifted under her steps, and fallen logs blocked parts of the path, forcing her to go around them. The distance was short, less than a quarter mile, but progress was slow. Behind her, the fire continued to move forward. Wind pushed embers ahead of the main fire, starting smaller fires in front of her. Flames appeared across her path. The fire was no longer only behind her. The heat increased and the air became hotter and harder to breathe. Smoke reduced visibility to a few feet. She continued moving, but more slowly. Her breathing became shorter, and each breath brought in heat and ash. Her eyes watered, and it became harder to see the ground ahead. The road was nearby but no longer visible. The fire reached her position before she reached the road. Search teams went in the next day after the fire moved through. The ground was still warm in some spots, covered in ash, with burned branches and debris scattered across the area. They found her less than a quarter mile from the road, in a section where the fire had passed through quickly and left almost nothing standing. Her camera was found nearby. The last photo showed part of the ridge with smoke already rising in the background. There were no clear landmarks in the image. The area around her showed that the fire had spread fast. Small fires had started ahead of the main flames, and the burn pattern was uneven, likely pushed by wind. The conditions made it difficult to move through the area on foot. It was March 14, 2016 in Colorado. The morning was clear and cold, with no wind moving through the trees. The trailhead was empty, the ground still frozen from the night before. Everything felt steady and routine, like any other early start, with nothing suggesting the conditions would change later. Robert Hale, 34, worked as a substitute teacher during the week and ran long distances on weekends. He lived in Pueblo and had built his routine over the years, moving from short races to ultramarathons. He was training for one more event and planned a final long run on a 38-mile alpine loop he had completed twice before. Those runs were in late summer. This time, snow covered the upper sections, but the forecast called for clear skies and light wind. He started at 5:45 a.m. The temperature was about 17 degrees Fahrenheit. The first half went as expected. Lower sections were frozen solid, and he moved through them without trouble. Around mile 23, he crossed a wide snowfield. It held under his weight. A few miles later, another section did the same. By mile 28, higher on the ridge, conditions changed. Wind picked up, and the snow became less consistent. Some areas were firm, others softer. At mile 31, the trail curved into switchbacks, but a sloped snowfield cut across the hillside ahead. It looked similar to what he had already crossed. He paused, tested it with his pole, and stepped onto it. The first steps held. About 30 feet in, the surface gave way. His left leg broke through into softer snow. His body kept moving while the leg stayed trapped, twisting his position. He lost balance and fell onto his side. His upper leg struck a rock hidden under the snow. The impact broke his femur. He stayed still at first, trying to understand the position. His leg lay at an angle he couldn't correct. Any movement caused sharp pain. He reached for his satellite device and tried to send a message. Instead of triggering an emergency signal, he typed a short message saying he had fallen and broken his leg. It went to a personal contact. There was no reply. He remained on the slope as the temperature began to drop. The snow beneath him compressed, pulling heat away from his body. He tried to adjust his position to stay warmer, but movement was limited. His jacket and gear were not enough to block the cold coming from the ground. Over time, the effects combined. The injury caused internal bleeding, but it did not stop him immediately. What changed more was his condition in the cold. His hands became harder to use. His movements slowed. He tried to keep himself alert, speaking for a while and shifting slightly when he could, but the effort became harder to maintain. As daylight faded, the temperature dropped further. The exposed ridge offered no cover from the wind. His body continued to lose heat. His breathing slowed, and his responses became less consistent. At some point during the night, he stopped moving. The message he sent was seen later that evening, but by then, it was already dark. Search teams went out the next morning and reached the area near the snowfield. They found him on the slope where he had fallen. There were signs he had tried to adjust his position early on, but not later. The medical report listed the cause of death as hypothermia, with the femur fracture and internal bleeding contributing to his inability to move or seek shelter.